Yeah, I can control it. That's fine. Water.
All right. Can everybody hear me okay? Yep. That's kind of a stupid question, because if you can't, you wouldn't answer.
Raise your hand
Sandy,
if you can't hear me.
there we go. So we're just going to get started. I'm torn between giving a few minutes for stragglers to come in and just getting going, but why waste any time? So, no feedback, right. For those who don't know me, my name is Sam Curry, the first of the listed presenters. I'm Chief Technology Officer at RSA, and I'm joined by Sandy, one of my colleagues.
I'm Sandy Carielli. I'm Product Manager at RSA. I'm responsible for some of the products in the data protection portfolio.
So hopefully this presentation is fun today. Everybody feeling good this afternoon? Oh, good lunch? Slowly slip into a sugar coma, right?
I'll pull you out of it.
We're going to present to you on distributed security, and of course the subtitle is Expanding the Toolkit for Institutional Resilience. I'm going to do everything I can to not mention any products by RSA. Some of the work that we did, you'll see actually led to a product, but we're now taking the principles, we're applying it as security practitioners across a lot of what we do. And we're hoping that this notion of being able to distribute, cryptographically distribute, not just split something in half and split it and put it in different places, but actually do some more deep forms of distribution can help with what we're calling institutional resilience, right? So how do you make certain vectors into the company a little harder for the bad guys, a little bit more expensive to crack or attack, and potentially be able to drive the bad guys in a behavioral way to paths where you have controls and you can monitor and those sorts of things. So if that makes sense to you, let's go to the first slide. I'm a physicist and a classicist by training, as I was reminded by a friend up here. And so in physics and in mathematics, you were a mathematician. We try to work in first principles. What are the things that we know to be true at a base level? And academic arguments notwithstanding, there are many ways you can define strength of security and security itself, but I think a really good practical one, practical meaning you can actually use it for things, is to define security strength as approximately proportional to and roughly equal to cost to break. And if you think about the bad guys who are trying to come in, this works best, by the way, when the bad guys are actually financially motivated. And when some of you saw my presentation here at Source 2 years ago, I talked about applying game theory to understanding certain classes of hackers. You want to be very careful when you apply game theory, by the way. So when you can quantify gains and losses for people, you can begin to predict how they'll behave. It's just like in business. If you can predict what an ROI looks like for your opponents, you can in fact predict where things are going to go. So when people are profit motivated, they will follow the path of least resistance, or put another way, the path to the greatest ROI, the greatest margin. That's difficult to measure sometimes, but you can see when things start to shift, how they're going to move. Now, where game theory breaks down. When you have too many opponents, when you have too many things to choose among, when they're in fact not smart, when they're stupid, so don't try this with script kiddies, right? Don't try it with hacktivists. In some cases, they can be smart, but they're not financially motivated, right? So the financial motivation makes sense. And in some classes, things like nation states may not behave that way. They may be willing to invest disproportionately to get at targets. So I wanted to think about how do people get to data, and of course there's three real use cases or three real instances where someone can steal data. That's data at rest, data in use, and data in transit. So our goal here isn't to say there's a way to make data more robust in all three of these. We're going to focus in mostly in data at rest, a little bit in data in transit. What we want to do is to make it really unattractive to go after that data at rest from a financial perspective, from an investment perspective, and a risk perspective for bad guys coming at organizations. And there is real value to be found in increasing the cost to break. The three use cases, we're going to focus in on one mostly, and reducing the likelihood of success, which also is a way of impacting cost. It means you have a very small window to in fact succeed, so think of the losses you have if you miss that window. Sandy?
Now, with institutional resilience, we are assuming that attackers are getting in. And we know this is the case because we're seeing this happen all the time. What's interesting about a lot of these, to Sam's point, is that most of these are attacks on data at rest. And they're going after the things that are easiest to get at, passwords, credentials, other things, and that are the most profitable. So going back to the discussion of profitability, what we're looking to do when we look at institutional resilience and when we talk about distributed security is not just make it harder for the attacker, increase the cost, but also make it less rewarding. Continue to decrease the profit. So, in the physical world, you might say that a burglar is going to attack or try to break into the only house on the block without the burglar alarm. If everyone on the block has a burglar alarm, then what is he going after? So you want to make it as unrewarding for him to break into your house as possible.
Yeah, and to emphasize here, it's data at rest. So there's a whole bunch of, we won't go through each of them, yay, right? I mean, but if you look at the trend here, it's that it's getting difficult to actually get things like access into identity theft through other means. Not impossible, just more difficult. And so it makes sense to go do smash and grabs for things like hashed passwords, go run that through a rainbow table, do your business, and then steal the identity, right? So this is a way of shoring up that particular vector, or at least making it more expensive.
Yep, and taking that information and seeing where else you can use it.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the people involved. So some principles of institutional resilience. The first point up here is that they can get in, right? And we don't like it. We try to stop people from getting in, and we try to stop as many as possible. But infrastructure compromise is eventually an inevitability. That doesn't mean information compromise has to be. So I work on the assumption in our shop, by the way, and I know some of my colleagues here do as well, that they're going to be inside. I get a kick, by the way, when I watch the movies, and you see the hacker starts typing and hits enter and goes, I got the data, right? It takes time. It's not a trivial undertaking to get into an enterprise environment, find the data, be able to do something with it, and get it out. But assume that they can get in. And then the mission becomes minimize the damage from the attack and return to normal business operations as quickly as possible. That's resilience. It's that you get punched in the gut and you're standing up again and it didn't take you out, right? So you're getting back to a normal state. So what does that mean for the good guys? Well, it means, first of all, the doctrine of the defense says, first, protect the business, right? Understand what it is that the bad guys are after. Make sure that that has the ability to stand up, stay running without essentially having a breach or a compromise. Second, prevent and prepare to optimally strengthen the enterprise. One of the things that I can be as guilty as anyone of, but in security we do is, hey, I thought of a way to get around that, therefore it's no longer worthwhile. Or, I want an extreme case. Over in RSA Labs, I always have to remind Dr. Ari Jules, it doesn't have to have the kind of fault tolerance in some cases that we expect from cryptography when you're doing a practical solution. It doesn't have to have the one failure in 3 billion in order to be useful. There's still value to be had in just being able to move the needle a little bit, make it more difficult for the bad guys. So optimally invest. There comes a point of diminishing returns when you try to make things too complex or too difficult to use. And adapting to beat the hackers in real time. There's a race between the good guys and the bad guys, and what we want to do is to be able to adapt. So for them, they want to maximize freedom of access. Right? What they want to do is come in and be able to get to anything at any point. If they have freedom to walk into the environment and come back at will, then leaving data around in pools doesn't make sense. Essentially, that hard outside has exposed a soft, chewy inside. They want to exploit access to complete their mission or to get a profit, and they want to adapt to be the defenders in real time. So just as a background, from some of those first principles, these are what we're working with now.
And when we look at institutional resilience, there are 3 pillars, but for this discussion, most of what we're going to be focusing on is that third pillar about recovery, because that's really where distributed security falls in. A few weeks ago, I was watching a movie with my kids. I was watching The Amazing Spider-Man. I don't know how many of you have seen it. But my youngest daughter, she was really a huge fan of the Lizard. She liked the Lizard, which is the villain, better than she liked Spider-Man, which I didn't really understand, but okay, she's 3. And what's interesting about the Lizard is he really exemplifies recovery in this case. The Lizard couldn't be stopped for any long period of time. You could cut off limbs, you could freeze limbs and have them fall off, and they would regenerate. So you weren't able to stop them for any period of time. And that's really what we're talking about in recovery. You can attack it, but you're able to grow it back and after a very short time recover and continue as normal. So distributed security is almost the digital equivalent of that. Cut off the Lizard's right arm, and by the time you're able to cut off the left arm, the right arm has grown back, and the Lizard is able to continue to fight. So when we talk about distributed security, what we're talking about is doing that cryptographically, splitting resources among 2 or more entities. And one thing you might ask here is how many should we be looking at? For most of this conversation, we'll be talking about 2. In some cases, you might look at 3. Any more than that, you're probably getting overly fancy. So let's assume 2 for now. And what's important about these 2 entities is that if you're able to compromise one of them, It doesn't bring down compromise of the entire system, and you don't actually gain enough information to be able to know more to try to compromise the rest of the system. The final part of this is that the system can fully recover from that single point being brought down and then quickly come back up to run as normal.
Yeah, and we're going to dive into this a little bit more. We don't mean just taking, as I said earlier, some message and splitting it, some data and splitting it. You can, in fact, extrapolate or interpolate to find missing data, quite simply. So what we're talking about is a more sophisticated form of cryptographic splitting. What we want to do is say, for instance, if you had a key and you want to split that key, you wouldn't just take the first half and the back half. You would use a changing way of choosing which parts get split and how they get shuffled and how they get changed, such that getting one half doesn't effectively reduce the entropy of figuring out through brute force the whole if you didn't have that half. So that's the kind of distribution that we're talking about, rather than just say, I'm just going to put every second bit in a different bucket.
Exactly.
So this is for fun, and what's amusing is earlier on, I was called out for always having something classical in a presentation that I give. And in this case, it says Proteus up there. We look for an example, right? You come to these things, you want to be entertained a little bit, and I go to these presentations, there's always somebody who has this really cool analogy from this mythologies, like the Hydra or something, right? Or Prometheus. And we really struggle to find one to represent this idea. So I don't know if you can read the small text there. It says, we'd very much like to know if someone can think of a better, interesting analogy. So email us if you can. And by the way, we'll go raid the marketing closet at RSA. Maybe you'll get an iPad out of that, or maybe you'll just get an RSA branded pen. We don't know. But we will definitely go on a mission to get you something cool. If it's a really good idea, we'll stick your name up here and we'll really try to get that iPad. But we don't actually have any prizes. I just want to put that up front, but we'll try and find one for you. So Proteus. Proteus was a very primordial deity or mythic figure in Greek mythology. Came before the gods, came before the Titans, and is often known as the primordial or firstborn. Something that is protean is early. It's also amorphous. It changes shape. And in fact, Hercules struggled to capture Proteus, and he changed shape. He became a lion, a serpent, a leopard, a pig, water, even tree. He eventually did, and I think Menelaus actually caught him, not Hercules. But constantly changing nature of the sea and liquidity of water. He was a god of elusive sea change. That's not just a tech term that gets overused. Everybody talks paradigm shifts and sea changes. That's actually what he was a god of. And so we thought maybe this was a good one. But again, the challenge is out there. If you guys can find a better one, let us know. Our email addresses are up here and you can get them after. So Proteus, just a cool story to help explain this. We want to capture those qualities that we're beginning to describe and then show new applications for it. And that's really what we're doing up here.
There are basically three key ideas to this, and we have talked through a little bit of them, but want to go into a little more detail. So the first thought is around distribution. Take these critical resources, and could be authentication credentials, could be keys, split the way that Sam suggested, could be other types of decision making, and split that among multiple servers. In this case, say 2. And the idea is our attacker has to compromise both in order to compromise the system as a whole. The other part of this that I mentioned earlier is not only does he have to compromise both, but compromising one doesn't get him enough information to be able to brute force or try to compromise the second. He really needs to be able to compromise both of them in that same time frame in order to compromise the system. So that's the first part. The second part is the diversification. And this goes back a little bit to what Dan was talking about during the keynote this morning, about nature really needing diversity. We want it to be harder to break into 2 systems, twice as hard ideally, or more than twice as hard than it is to break into one of them. So in this case, you don't necessarily want your 2 servers sitting right next to each other, maybe the same admin credentials, same OSs, same environment. Probably pretty easy for someone to jump from one to the other. What we're looking to do when we diversify the systems is put them in places where it is less intuitive that they are related to each other, that they are protected by different mechanisms, maybe different people have responsibility for them. In this case here, we have 2 servers spread out where one is in the enterprise and one is hosted in the cloud. So our would-be attacker has to compromise not only your enterprise, but some cloud provider. We really want to up the ante, make it much, much harder and more costly for our attacker to get at both of these servers.
And keep in mind as well, there's some cost X, right? Cost in terms of time and cash and resources to break something. You want to get this as close to 2x as possible. If you wind up architecting it in a way where your application that does the splitting is a single point of failure, then that's not 2x, that's less than x, right? If you have the same controls and you have proximity between the two secrets or the two split paths, then somebody can get it for less than 2x. So you want to architect the system from a hacker's perspective, and how difficult is it for me to find and compromise both parts? The compromise of one should, in theory, at least give you the heads up to continue that race and beat the bad guys to say, all right, let's go destroy the other half and resplit, which is incredibly frustrating. So the bad guys essentially have to get, if you split it into two, which we think is most practical in terms of solutions we've seen, but if you split it into 3 or 4, you don't win at n-1, you win when the bad guy gets n, right? And so you want to make each increment that you split it for worth a whole nother attack cycle for the bad guys, right? Potentially different targets, different places, different systems, and different security controls.
Different skill sets, different things the attacker has to know in order to break the system, exactly. And one thing we'll hit upon a little bit later in this discussion is what are the different vectors in which you might want to diversify, and how you sort of manage that diversity versus the practicality of still needing to use this information. So our final area is around the idea of self-healing. This is sort of where the recovery comes in. And this is the idea that these two servers on a regular basis want to essentially resplit our data, resplit our secrets, so that if an attacker compromises one server at time 1 and a resplit happens, if the attacker compromises the other server later, they don't have a match set. They don't have any new information. So we changed the way the secret's split, we changed the shape of it, and therefore force an attacker to not only compromise our two servers, but we're really compressing their window of time in which to do so. So again, it's about adding to the cost. So they still have to compromise two, and they have to do it much.
Yeah, and keep in mind as well, this is for data at rest, right? We're not talking about data in use, because data in use isn't effectively split, at least not simply split. So we talk about the time X interval. I mean, if you can get it so that you refresh this at less than 2x, and it does take 2x of effort for the bad guys to get it, then they're going to be incredibly frustrated. It means they have to therefore invest that much more in finding better techniques to be able to get to it. And ideally, you want it in less than x. But practically speaking, it's computationally expensive to do these things, especially over large pools of data. If you're, for instance, doing key rotation and key management, you may want to split your keys, right? So in that world, you have to think very carefully about the cycles for doing that. How often are they accessible? How often are they rotated? How often are they split? And then how hard is it for somebody to actually break into those? And then what do you monitor for?
And an example of this, building on what Sam had talked about with splitting, where you could take a piece of data or a key and basically have a map of which bits are stored on which server. A refresh, self-healing, basically means on an ongoing basis, we'll change the map and change the way that those bits are split and divided up. So if we put this all together, we're basically forcing our attacker to do two things: breach two servers with a very diverse set of characteristics, and do that in a much shorter period of time. So increasing the cost, and again, if they break one, they don't have much of interest, so ideally we're reducing their value as well.
And keep in mind that the self-healing says that that half is only useful with its other matching half, and that if you resplit, it doesn't matter how many halves you get, you aren't reducing the entropy. You have to get a matching pair. So that's important. So the cyclical way that you do this, rather than just splitting once, will be really an important part of any practical system.
So let's look at this for a moment from the standpoint of our attacker. What we have here are our two servers, and basically these arrows represent on an ongoing basis the self-healing that's going on. Every time they communicate with each other, they are changing the map. They're changing the way that our key or our secret has been split. So our attacker comes in, and they compromise the one on the bottom, the reddish one, and they're able to take the information from there. Again, this does not give them enough information to put the entire secret together. They only have half. They can try and brute force or guess the rest, but they don't have any additional information. Then we go through, and the servers on an ongoing basis, again, are doing this refresh. So by the time our attacker has figured out how to compromise the top one, the blue one, we've already done a couple of cycles of self-healing. So our attacker ends up with two pieces that don't match, and chances are our attacker doesn't even realize that for a while. So we're frustrating them tremendously by really forcing them to work much faster and go after multiple targets.
Yeah, they would have to effectively breach both the blue line and the red line before one of those cross arrows occurs.
Yep. In these little windows.
Because every time one of those arrows appears, both halves get reset according to a new map, right, according to a new schema.
So why do we do this?
Yeah, so why distribute security? Well, we talked a little bit up front about the different use cases and some first principles. Intrusion resilience is important. If you're an organization and you're saying, well, how do I in fact make my company harder to break into, more expensive to break into in my organization? You can't afford limitless budgets to put controls on every path. So being able to say that I've actually spent very little, and I've got a simple set of operations that even the network operations guys could manage, right? That they could actually take that and just run it in an ongoing way, says I can actually focus my resources elsewhere. I can do some minimal monitoring and logging, make sure things are done properly, and check it. And now you can actually spend much more time on the in-use cases when things are in applications. You can do your application hardening. You can look at other things, and you can look at the transit layer as well. That's the first reason. It just makes sense to shore that up because you don't want to see that somebody has done a smash and grab and it's been published. They got all their hashes. Instead, they got something functionally useless. The second one is liability reduction. Basically, a breach of a site or one of these halves doesn't expose sensitive data at all. Now, my legal counsel is always quick to point out I'm not a lawyer, but something tells me that if you were to put this in front of a lawyer, and remember there's no precedent here, that they could make an argument for saying that a breach hasn't effectively occurred, right? If you can make that case, it's difficult to cross that divide with the business, and there's no explicit regulation I know around this. It may put you in a state where it's even more interesting than where somebody has stolen encrypted data. And exposure, passwords, live questions, and so on doesn't have to have an impact on things like PII or on the company or on users. And of course, privacy protection. Things like sensitive information like geolocation could be used against people, could be used to infer patterns and what have you, and to authenticate users without exposure to one site. So think about how you might be able to make things a bit beefier from a privacy perspective and for end users. Sandy?
Yeah, the other aspect of this that we wanted to touch on is, sort of speaking of geography, regulations around there about where data can be stored. And again, I will echo Sam's comment. I'm not a lawyer either and recommend chatting with a lawyer about this. But in situations where perhaps sensitive data is not allowed to be stored in a particular country in certain areas, the question can be asked, well, what if part of the data, what if a split of the data could be stored there? Is that an option? So it sort of becomes interesting, what does a split of the data mean? Is it the same value as encrypted? Could you store that in a place that you wouldn't normally be able to store the entire piece of data? So let's talk a little bit about separation, because this is a really interesting area. We've talked about splitting two servers, but how do we actually separate those, and what's practical? The best example of separation that I could think of as I was thinking about this over the past couple of weeks comes from a kid's story, Harry Potter, and our big bad Voldemort, who managed to take his soul and divide it in 7 pieces, 7 Horcruxes, and he scattered it around the realm. And it was really, really, really hard for Harry Potter and his friends to go and retrieve and destroy all of those Horcruxes.
By the way, if you submit that one, it won't get you a prize. What's that? Actually, we can answer that, but because essentially, there's that. Although we could keep it in the room, right? But essentially, he's still in each instantiation, right? Whereas this, the data's not actually usable in its split function. So maybe we're just splitting hairs, but I don't mean to interrupt you, Sandy. Just don't submit that one. We're looking for a better one. Every one we found faults with, but we may just be too picky.
But yeah, and the thing about Voldemort's approach is, well, it's, for our purposes, overkill. And he never actually wants to put those pieces back together. He never wants to use them again. He never wants anyone to find them again. For the rest of us, that doesn't work. The data that we're splitting, the data that we're storing in split form, we need to use on a fairly regular basis. We need to use those keys. We need to use credentials. We need to use other information that we're splitting. So we can't split it in, 100 pieces and scatter it all over the place. It's just not practical.
You might as well destroy it at that point.
Right. It's not practical from a performance and a usability standpoint. So we need to find kind of a happy medium. So there are several separation vectors you can look at. And our assumption is that no organization and no implementation of this is going to use everything. We're going to pick a few. We're going to pick the ones that make sense for the organization or for the use case. And for the other ones where we're not able to do that, we're going to have other controls. Remember, this is a part of defense in depth, so we assume that there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on around this. And this is just part of the puzzle. So admin accounts are kind of interesting, talking about splitting admin access to this. That's great for large organizations where you have multiple admins. If you're a smaller org where there's only one admin, practically you can't have two admins, one each administering the server. So it's one that works in some cases and doesn't work in others.
To be clear, what we're trying to do around that is make it twice as expensive, twice as difficult. 2 identities to hack, 2 passwords to get to each server.
2 people to stalk and see if you can get them to give up the information.
Right.
Yep. On the execution environment side, another one to highlight is imagine all of the vulnerabilities and 0 days and stuff that come out. Can you have an additional layer of protection by having, say, Linux and mainframe, or AIX and Linux, or something along those lines, so that as something happens in one particular OS, it doesn't affect the other server where there's a different operating system.
At the very least, they'll have to have different attack methodologies in order to compromise each environment.
But our assumption here is that in any implementation, in any deployment, we're going to pick and choose the ones that make the most sense for our environment, and we really need to consider how we're going to continue to do business operationally. Which of these can we do without negatively impacting usability, negatively impacting performance?
And some of this will also have to do with who you think the bad guys are and what vectors you think they'll try to reach you. For instance, physical separation might help in the case of some insiders, depending on your business or your industry. If you're concerned about people who are typically their MO is going after admin accounts, then it makes sense to think about that. But you're never going to get to the 2x type of cost analysis and time analysis until you split all of these. But you don't have to. Remember, it's not a 100% game.
Exactly. So the other thing to consider as you're talking about separation is the deployment continuum of separation. And really there's a range that we wanted to cover. You start really on one end with having both servers, both segments in the same enterprise. And you can go all the way up to cloud deployments where maybe you have them in different cloud environments, maybe different cloud providers, or one in a public cloud, one in a private cloud. And each one of these has different benefits, but also different things that you have to consider and questions that you have to ask your vendors and yourselves when you're doing these deployments. So if you start with in the enterprise, this is probably the one that Voldemort hates, right? Because it's the easiest one, everything's there. But it's the one that realistically most of us are dealing with right now, or many of us are dealing with right now. Figuring out, okay, we're going to store this in the enterprise, how do we separate it? What are the right separation vectors? And what policies and what personnel decisions do we have in place that are going to make certain types of separation vectors viable or not? It's the most challenging in some ways because we're dealing with the same set of assets. We're not necessarily going to run out and buy something on a completely different operating system if we don't already manage that. But this is, a fairly common thing, and there's a lot we can do within the enterprise to have some separation and make it a little more challenging. As you move up, think about a partnership scenario between 2 enterprises, and maybe we want both enterprises to have some skin in the game. We want both of them to bear some of the risk. So it's kind of a nice way to split risk between the 2 enterprises by saying, okay, you guys have one server, we have another server, our attacker has to compromise us and our partner in order to get at that information.
It's not a least common denominator, it's a greatest bar, right? So you're actually getting the strength of whoever has the best security in that scenario.
By the same token, you also have to look at the backup policy and the management policy of both sides. If one of the partners falls down on the job in terms of backups and their server goes down, it's going to be very hard to recover on that because they've lost half of the data. So,
And a point about backups, if you are thinking just linearly in time, I've got, red half for time t, and both red and blue half have been destroyed, but the blue half exists in backup, and somebody doesn't need to get it in real time, right? So think about how the backups of the halves are managed.
the other thing to think about is the latency between the servers. How much time are you willing to allow to take those two pieces and put them back together as you're working? And generally, if the two organizations are sitting fairly far apart and there's a lot of latency between them, it's going to take a little longer. So figuring out what you're okay with in that regard is also important. As we move further up the continuum, then you have the example that we talked about earlier, enterprise and cloud. And this is something that we can see actually a lot of folks being interested in. As we've spoken with various people about this concept, this is the one where we get a lot of questions. Hey, could we put one in the cloud? So in there, we still have the latency question going between the enterprise and the cloud. We also, again, want to understand, okay, what are the backup policies? What's in place with the cloud? We can control what we can control on the enterprise side on our end. We can't control what our partner, what our cohort, what our cloud provider is doing. So we need to understand that, and ideally we want to see the extent to which we can match that to make sure that we're doing backups as regularly as they are, or that they're doing backups as regularly as we are. Moving further up, then we get to within the cloud. And where within the cloud starts to look interesting is not just for enterprises, but you can imagine for individual users, you and me, who maybe want to store some of our data in this manner. So imagine there could be a cloud service that I could take advantage of and say that I want my passwords or some of my sensitive documents or anything like that, rather than stored in one location, I want it split in the cloud.
And keep in mind that at any given cloud service provider, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, they're not, or even software as a service, they're not known for heterogeneity in their environment, right? Their business model is based on scaling, and scaling means that they can basically instantiate machines and tear them down very, very quickly, which means that they tend to all look the same. So you want to be extremely careful, especially of how they do their physical security, how their admins work. I think that goes without saying, but you want to make sure that they can actually demonstrate some form of separation, or it's worse than you're within the enterprise case.
Exactly, yeah. Excellent point. We need to know how they're doing separation. We'll ask the same questions that we would ask ourselves as an enterprise. We would want to ask that to our cloud provider. And then at the most extreme level of separation, you can imagine between clouds. And these can be two separate cloud providers. It could be within the same cloud provider, maybe a public cloud and a private cloud. And again, you can apply this to individuals as well as organizations. But again, in this case, we don't just need to understand how the enterprise would coordinate with the cloud provider or how the cloud provider is managing separation itself. We need to understand how these two cloud providers are interacting, how their backup policies are, how they're managing separation, and decide whether that works for us. Make sure that the backup procedures are such that if one cloud provider has a problem, there's an easy way to restore it and get my data back. The last thing I would want to do is split something, put it in the cloud, and then have one of my cloud providers have some sort of massive issue and have lost everything. And finally, the other question to ask again here is, what is the latency between these two clouds? And do I care about that in terms of the speed of putting my data back together?
Yeah, and given the fact that the communications is happening outside of your control, think also about who potentially can instrument that and see it and infer what the halves are as part of the distribution and separation mechanism.
So we went through a lot of options here, but you can see that there are, depending on your organizational maturity, your interest, how far along you are in the cloud, you have a lot of options to consider here of how you'd want to deploy this.
So we originally were going to do a walkthrough of a number of these, but we thought rather than do that, if anybody wants to discuss some of these in particular, here's some use cases where we can actually see it in action, because we want to emphasize pragmatism here. The first is authentication. I think if you take something like hashes of passwords, and split that, I think it becomes immediately obvious that somebody needs both halves or n halves, depending on how many times you split it, in order to be able to then run that against a rainbow table and figure out passwords. That's kind of interesting. There's also an authorization use case that's a little bit harder. That's where somebody actually tries to compromise, for instance, Kerberos and get essentially the tickets that will give access, that will enable you to have certain entitlements, right? So if you start thinking about what can be split in that environment, there's some use cases. My favorite is the signature and the CA side. Things like signing keys and root keys, when they're not actually being used to sign, why should they be sitting around just in their normal state? Or even just encrypted. That's a simple smash and grab, get a secret, figure it out and do it. Why not split these multiple ways if they're not actually in use at any given point in time? And data, I think if we can do it for things like hashes, it becomes relatively simple to do it for things like PII or personal health information, or things that have been labeled as sensitive in the company. Things like perhaps static files around things like insider information and distribution of things. Some of the more interesting ones that we started to think about were consumer use cases, but in most of those use cases, finding out where, as an end user, you'd be most interested in it is a tough one. So maybe somebody will do a splitting as a service, and you may want to put your tax documents there or something that you think is sensitive, or pictures, or who knows. But remember, splitting it also reduces the amount of information that each half carries with it. So you can actually pay lower rates to each of the cloud providers who might be behind it, like SkyDrive or Dropbox or what have you. But these are 4 basic ones, and we listed them here because what we wanted is for you to think, how could I use this principle, or where could I take it and use it? And if you've done some kind of risk analysis or threat analysis on your organization, as you know you've got data sitting in a big pool and it keeps you up at night worrying about it, it's a good principle to think about how you might be able to split it or use some of these concepts to make them more resilient or robust for data at rest.
One area I've had good conversations about recently, I spoke to I guess it was a cloud provider a few weeks ago, and they were concerned not about passwords so much as they were about challenge questions and some of the PII that's located in your answers to challenge questions about mother's maiden name or where you went to school or things like that. So being able to split that sort of information that is out there and being used, and once someone knows it, they know it, and you can't really, unlike changing your password, you can't change the answer to where you went to school.
But remember, in that case, it's probably more that you don't want to be seen as the person who gave it up,
Yeah.
rather than making it actually more difficult to get my mother's maiden name, right? So, because that information is available from other places. You just don't want to be the people who have to go on CNN or do a new press conference that says, we're the ones who gave it up.
Right, it goes back to the liability reason, absolutely.
So some key takeaways, and then we'll actually open it up for questions, comments, and discussion. Distributed security, I think, is a core component of institutional resilience. This should be in your toolkits. We don't think enough work has been done publicly on how to do this type of distribution. We, of course, have started it at RSA, and we use it internally. We're building it into products. It's not there's a thing that we sell, but there's also things that we're putting into products. So things like, how do we split seed records inside of Authentication Manager for Secure ID, so that if somebody ever gets your master password and knocks it over, it doesn't matter, because they only get 1/2 within. There's a red server and a blue server inside of it. Applications like that. If you happen to sell products, think about what do you store that you potentially would not want somebody to be able to knock over as well. But we don't think that's a big enough component in people's cryptographic toolkit. Second is, in a distributed security system, compromise of one part is completely recoverable. We really mean completely recoverable. And you can, in fact, further split a half. So even if you don't have the opportunity to reconstruct the data and resplit, you can actually take, so if you split it in red and blue, you can take the red and you can split it into yellow and green. So you can further complicate and split on the fly to prevent somebody from assembling all the pieces they need in order to reconstruct the information of the data. That's incredibly useful. And last but not least, distributed security systems we think can be deployed according to organizational risk tolerance. Having it in the toolkit lets you deal with some of those shades of gray of how you deal with risk. I mean, how much risk are you willing to embrace? First, the problem we have as I think an industry is most companies can't talk about IT risk in the same language they talk about other forms of risk. That's a separate problem. When you start to embrace risk, you can in fact then make sure you take enough. But you really want to be able to say, you know what, the problem with putting data with that provider or in that country or around this application which contains PII or something that would be the death of the company if it was lost, you can in fact say, well, I have a solution for how to make it not a death event. Infrastructure compromise doesn't have to equal information compromise. So with that, I think we'll open it up to questions. But Sandy, do you have any final comments too?
I think just want to reiterate that lower point there, that you saw a lot of different options here, and we're going to assume we're not doing everything. But depending on how your organization is handling their infrastructure and deployment right now, and where you think the biggest risk lies, you can really tailor your distribution and diversity in order to best meet those issues.
So guys, any comments or questions? Yeah.
What kind of overhead, CPU cycles, this guy out of network, and if you're able to reconstruct the whole from any part, which is what I heard you say, and you're having this continual dialogue between the parts to rotate the magic pattern, then it seems like you're going to incur, well, I don't want to say significant, the question is, what percentage, the rate percentage overhead are we talking about to achieve that?
Yeah, so that's a good set of points. So first is the option that you choose, how you distribute, how far, what those separation vectors that you choose will add to your overhead, right? I mean, they're going to. But then you don't, at one end of the spectrum, you could be doing it continually, which means the data is effectively always assembled if somebody's monitoring a system. At the other end, you could do it on very large frequency and very large periods, but at that point, you're giving the hackers more time to reassemble stuff. So I'm going to say there are trade-offs in memory. What's the application does the splitting? How do you protect that? You're going to have to think about the communications streams. You're going to have to think of the whole system. This is just a tool in the toolkit. And that we want to avoid the reductio ad absurdum, which is just saying that by keeping going, by just taking this to the extreme, we then say, therefore, it's not worthwhile. If you have a system where you split some of these things, and then you do what we do in this room, which is step back and say, how would I attack that system? You're still going to have to say, all right, first of all, on the business side, am I willing to accept the overhead? Can I still perform what the data exists for as a function? And then as a security guy, is this actually increasing the cost meaningfully on some vectors bad guys would choose, or is it introducing new vectors that they could potentially exploit? Right? You don't want to have them say, I'm just going to go for that app that does the splitting and it's all over. Right? But you're right, there are going to be trade-offs, and big performance trade-offs potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. On the performance side, one of the things we talked about here was measuring the latency between those two servers. As you think about the deployment, you really want to measure that in advance and think about, what your user base will tolerate in terms of that latency. Will they wait an extra X number of milliseconds or an extra second in order to get certain types of data back if it is split in this manner?
And just as in the storage world, they sometimes use things like flash storage for real time because of its speed, but its high energy use. They use things like SATA, it takes a little longer to get to, but less energy. In this case, you may say, I only care about doing splitting on the archive data. I don't care about doing it on the real time. I'll accept the risk around that. But it's not actually at rest for long enough. But that stuff that you rarely access, you may decide you want to do it there. Right? In some cases, you have to keep things 7, 10, 15 years. Why is it just sitting in a pool waiting for a breach? Other thoughts? At the back? Yeah, Mike?
What's the process for moving from that directly to you?
Well, so you really got three parts, right? You've got each half and the central part. And so it's not that there's a process for doing it. The ways we've implemented it, we could talk about, but there are different ways you could implement or architect a solution like this. Sandy? It's not like there's one, right? It's, I'm reminded when you stick encryption keys in a running application, and that application gets cracked. If it's something like a symmetric key, you're done. Like somebody just needs access to the data to get to it. So the principles by which you, in my example earlier of a key that you're splitting, what do you do with each half actually is less important than what you do with the map, right? But somebody still has to get both halves and the map. That's a harder problem than just getting a key. So you still have to put strong controls around some of those single points of failure. And however you architect the system, you got to make sure you know where they are and you're putting the controls in place. You're probably monitoring too. There was another question? have, Frank?
So there have been some fairly dramatic blameouts of cloud providers
Yeah.
that we all know about. And either expected or didn't expect, whatever. The fact is, these things do fail and go bad.
Yep.
So when you're looking at a scenario in the cloud, between providers, you probably need to plan on having a renewal tackles that are recovered. And so I'm just wondering, it seems to me one of the constraints here is that synchronization happening rapidly not only works in your favor, it probably works against you too.
Yeah.
If you go down at the wrong moment, I mean, and you got 100% guarantee in this kind of arrangement that you really can get back to two matching pairs again. Not even yes, there is a virtual.
Yeah.
No, there is no 100% guarantee of that. There is always a way, but you want it to be harder this way, significantly harder for your investment than it would be the old
I'm
way.
talking about, forget about an attacker.
From the standpoint of recovering and,
Yeah.
I'm split between on-premise and cloud. Cloud goes down,
And where's that half now? Yeah.
and so now.
So that's
yeah.
a trust in the cloud problem. And by the way, it's a big one for all vendors, right? So so you deal with 3 vendors. What happens if one of them goes broke? What happens if somebody comes in and locks the door up? Yeah. In fact, we saw one where the FBI took down an ISP and a company in Switzerland failed, right? Because they simply no longer had access, right? That was in The Economist, I think, about a year and a little bit ago. This is a big problem in this kind of environment. So you may actually be thinking, if you have a different set of problems around how do you make sure that you're resilient to that, a lot of that's going to default to how you think about the cloud as an organization.
Well, it's not just a problem, it's premise versus cloud, it's premise versus premise. You could go down at any moment in the conversation and say process. And then I guess what you're saying is the fallback is that any surviving half can reconstruct the whole and get the thing back.
Actually, in this case, it can't.
Yeah.
No. So you can't reconstruct it from a half. You can't, just like the bad guys can. So this would be to make it difficult to do that. The business may say, are
It's
you
why-
crazy?
yeah.
Why would you do that, right? But that's a different kind of conversation to have.
And it's why you really want to think about how you implement and how you deploy it and what sort of backups of even the 2 halves you have so that if the cloud goes
And
down.
a word
you
of
have that
advice,
too.
by the way, not to get too cute, with think about the press. They're stupid, right? I'm being really fair, I think, when I say that. If you try to say, if you get a question from someone in the press who says, so you had data on Cloud X, and Cloud X got hacked and went out of business. So what happened? You can say, well, I had something split on Cloud X, and yeah, they got that, but it doesn't actually affect us. Do you think you can explain this concept to the press? Right? So you may in fact have to suffer through a breach from a brand perspective and exposure perspective without ever having lost anything, right? Same problem exists when you say, yeah, they had data, but it was encrypted. And so do think through carefully what it is that you're going to be getting protection against. You had your hand up.
So, yeah, I was trying to be possible to tweak this a little bit, so like you adopt a rate model where you only need 2 out of 3 pieces, they're made the whole.
Yeah, we call that
talked
M of
about
N internally. Yes, absolutely it is. The libraries that you would use for it would be a little bit different, and the way that you would do the cryptographic splitting is different because you would actually be significantly reducing the entropy with every compromised node out of M, right? So if you had, what you want to say, out of N rather, so if you had M of N nodes, you could effectively rebuild it all. In that case, maybe you can find a balance between it's significantly enough more difficult to break, and I can still do his question of being able to reconstitute the data from 2 out of the 3 cloud providers. But the bad guys still have to get 2 out of the 3. All right, well guys, thank you again.
Thanks very much.
Why don't we go back to the Proteus slides, people can see our email addresses, and
Yep.
seriously, we will raid the marketing closet and find it if somebody comes up with a good one. So hope to hear from you. Thanks, guys.